Every year that I was in grade school, our PE teacher, Mrs. Chris, would always have a giant unit of line dancing. Now you might know line dancing. Line dancing is a type of country music dancing where everyone lines up together and you all have the exact same moves. And so you would imagine all these second and third graders with little tiny Mr. Lane would all line up, and Mrs. Chris would tell us commands. She would tell us, well, maybe as a group we were to move forward, and so to the beat we would walk forward. Or maybe to the beat we were supposed to walk backwards, and we would walk backwards. And sometimes she might tell us just to slide past each other. And we would do it, and so you'd have lines of grade schoolers all dancing to the music. Now that I'm a lot older and I'm here teaching earth science, I realized that while Miss Chris was teaching us about dancing, it's really the exact same way that our planet moves. And instead of having little tiny grade schoolers move around, it's really the same way that our continents and our tectonic plates move. So in this video, in the spirit of Mrs. Chris, my grade school PE teacher, we're going to look and describe how exactly our continents and our plates here on the Earth are moving around. So we're going to end up doing three different things. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to describe how the tectonic plates move on our planet. And then we're going to identify the three major types of boundaries, or types of movements that happen on our planet. And finally, we're going to describe some of the key features and examples of each different type of boundary. So anytime you're talking about plate tectonics, you have to be thinking about convection. Now, Mrs. Chris, in my grade school class, my grade school PE, she was telling us commands. She would tell us to move forward and backwards and side to side, but really on our planet, there's no person yelling out to the continents which way to move. Instead, it's all about convection. And if you remember, inside our planet, inside the mesosphere, is liquid magma that's moving around in a circle. It's getting hot down by the outer core and rising up where it cools at the surface and moves aside, and it makes these giant circles called convection. In fact, one time, from one whole circle, we call that a convection cell. Now, our planet is made up of tons of them. In fact, there's many, many convection cells inside our mantle, all moving it around. And because of that, because there's many different convection cells, our surface, the crust or the lithosphere, is being pulled and pushed in different directions. Some places, the Earth's surface is being pulled apart. We would call that a divergent boundary. And there's other places where the convection is pushing the plates together, and we would call that convergent. And still other places where they just slide past each other, and we would call that a transform area, or transform boundary. But all the movement on our planet, from our tectonic plates, is all because of convection inside the mantle. So let's look at each different type of movement in detail. Let's start with giant tugs of war. You know, there's places on the Earth's crust where the surface is being pulled apart, almost like a giant tug of war, where one piece of the land is being pulled this way and one might be being pulled that way. We call these places divergent boundaries. Divergent boundaries are places where the Earth's surface is dividing. So, divergent boundary, divide. Here, convection is pulling them in opposite directions. It's pulling the land apart. So you can think about it. If you pull something, let's say a piece of taffy or maybe clay, it gets really thin in the center. And that's exactly what happens to our lithosphere. When it gets pulled apart, the actual lithosphere gets thin and thins out. In fact, at some places, it might even crack open. In the middle of our ocean are these giant volcanoes that actually circle the globe. And it's all divergent boundaries where the ocean floor has been pulled apart and breaks open to make these volcanoes and pushes apart North America and Africa. That's what made Pangea, broke apart Pangea. It also happens, though, on land. In fact, there's a place in Africa called the Great Rift Valley, in eastern Africa, actually, around the Horn, Ethiopia and Somalia, where Africa is actually being pulled apart. Different convection is pulling Africa in different directions. In fact, it's created a crack in the ground, or this giant valley called the Great Rift Valley. The Nile actually begins in the Rift Valley, and Lake Victoria is there. So everything you learn in Egypt, right, and the Nile that led to that giant civilization, it's all because of plate tectonics. And here in the Great Rift Valley, you would find lots of volcanoes and earthquakes, and it's all because the crust is really thin because it's being pulled apart at a divergent boundary. Well, sometimes though, the continents, the plates, the pieces of the ocean aren't being pulled apart, they're being pushed together. We call that a convergent boundary. Convergent boundaries are where the plates collide. Divergent, divide, convergent, collide. And so here, convection is pushing the continents together. I like to think of convergent boundaries like a car crash, right? You could imagine two giant pieces of continent slowly moving together, being pushed by convection, and they slam into each other. If you've ever seen a car accident, and hopefully no one got hurt, everything gets bent and cracked, and there's things going all over the place, and the same thing happens in a convergent boundary. When plates collide, they might create giant mountain ranges or volcanoes. You might have earthquakes and all sorts of really exciting things in geology. There's a very special type of convergent boundary called subduction, and that's where a continent and an oceanic plate collide. In fact, we have a whole other video you can watch that's all about subduction. Here in Oregon, subduction is a really important thing for you to understand. A great example of a convergent boundary is actually the largest mountain range in the world, the Himalayas. The Himalayas were formed by India, which used to be its own separate continent, colliding with Asia. And as they slowly collided, all the land of Asia and India got buckled and bent and created these giant mountain ranges. Over time, these have just gotten larger and larger. In fact, the largest part of the Himalayas, Mount Everest, is over 29,000 feet tall. That's 3 Mount Hoods for here in Sandy. The mountain ranges are so large and such huge that they change weather patterns all over the globe. In fact, the Himalayas, this giant mountain range caused by colliding continents, create monsoons. They help feed El Nino and La Nina here on the West Coast. It's a huge effect, and it's all caused by continents colliding. Well, sometimes you have continents pulling apart and dividing, and you have them colliding, but there's other times when they just move past each other. Sometimes convection doesn't push and pull things, it just slides them past each other. We call that a transform boundary. And transform boundaries are where continents and plates slide. Divergent, divide, convergent, collide, and transform, slide. Here, convection is just going in opposite directions, not really at each other or away from each other, and so the continents and plates are just kind of pulled apart or slid past each other. Now, the sliding isn't perfectly smooth. It's not like where you just slide around, or how Mrs. Chris had us grade schoolers slide around. Instead, it's very sticky. Sometimes the rocks might get stuck together, and energy would build up. And eventually, there'd be enough energy to overcome being stuck, and they would slide past each other and cause an earthquake. So transform boundaries are places on our planet where we find lots and lots of earthquakes. Really, the perfect example of a transform boundary is a place called the San Andreas Fault. It's a fault line or boundary that runs actually a little bit through Mexico by Baja all the way up through Southern California to San Francisco. And it's a place where a piece of California is actually sliding past and moving away up towards Alaska. Over 20 million people live along this line, along this transform boundary. And as a result, there are lots and lots of earthquakes. In 1989 in particular, there was a very large earthquake in San Francisco. That was all a result of a transform boundary. They're on the San Andreas Fault. So there you have it. There's our 3 types of boundaries. So what did we actually do in this video? Well, we did 3 things. The first thing we did is we described how convection can move the tectonic plates around our Earth. And it's all about hot things rising and cool things falling. We then saw the 3 major types of boundaries. A divergent boundary where things divide, a convergent boundary where plates collide, and a transform boundary where plates slide. Then, lastly, we described some of the key features and examples of different types of tectonic boundaries. That at a convergent boundary, you're going to get these giant collisions in mountains, maybe in volcanoes. divergent boundary, you're going to get rift valleys and giant cracks in the ground. And at a transform boundary, you're going to get lots of earthquakes because it's just sliding past each other. So let me remind you how these videos work. If I'm talking really fast, you can always hit pause and take some notes or take a break, or go back and watch a section again, or if you need to, watch the whole video again. But always remember to keep moving forward.